Hello, good morning,
Hello.
everybody. I'm very pleased to announce
Wait a bit, Professor. Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm terribly sorry, but we had several technical problems here to solve. Now we are in good conditions to proceed with our plenary session, and I will immediately pass the micro to Mariana Sigala, who is a well-known, renowned researcher in the field of wine tourism. She is a professor at the University of Piraeus in Greece, and I will pass her the word because she is in a hurry. Thank you very much to be with us and talk to us about expanding and enriching the wine tourism experience. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and sorry, but yes, I'm teaching after I finish from here, so I need to be very, very quick and efficient. I'll try to share my screen first. I hope it will work. Yeah. So I've selected to talk about how can we actually enrich and expand our wine tourism experiences. And the rationale for doing that, as you can imagine, is because the demand is demanding it. There used to be a kind of a stereotype in terms of who is the wine tourist. I think nowadays we all agree that the profile has also expanded and diversified globally. So if we think about age, stereotype, maybe the wine tourist, a middle age or a retired person with time and money to spend, well, that's not the case. Worldwide, whenever we go to wineries, we even see children or babies participating in wine tourism experiences. Some people, they might think about this as bizarre, particularly in Europe. I'm a European. I was really surprised when I first saw it in Australia, children being exposed in alcohol consumption. But believe me, this is in some way the norm, because wine tourism experiences are becoming a kind of a family destinations or experiences, a time that families can spend together, a quality time and then entertainment or even an educational time together. Nationality. We see people from many different nationalities participating in wine tourism. Chinese tourists overwhelming the chateaux in France, the wineries in Australia. Wine tourism in China is booming and replicating the wine experiences with fake chateaux in China as well, as you know. India, a destination that you say, well, do they produce wine? Well, not only they produce wine, they have wine festivals, each one of them gathering something like 5,000 and 10,000 people. As you know, the population in India is quite huge. People from religions that they don't allow wine consumption. And nowadays you have heard about wineries creating wine without alcohol and trying to improve the process of taking the alcohol out to expand and reach to this kind of cultures. In terms of life stage, again, wine tourism activity, it was perceived stereotypically as something like an extra leisure activity for people to do during your free time, an extra time. Well, nowadays we see a very popular type of market segment, the three-generational wine tourists. You have the kids or the grandkids, the parents and the grandparents, all together visiting the wineries and wine destinations to celebrate milestones, to celebrate lifetime events like weddings, baptism, platinum, celebrations of weddings, you name it. And of course, as you can imagine, the more generations you have, the more varied services you have to provide to satisfy anyone. Kids menu, playgrounds, alcohol-free, no alcohol-free, educational activities, women activities, you name it. Income. The stereotype, again, it was that the wine tourists are also people that they have a quite high income to spend. Well, think about wine tourism experiences in Santorini, for example. And I give this example because everyone knows Santorini. Visiting wineries, it's one of the standard offer in packages to cruise passengers. Cruise passengers, they jump into the buses. They don't even know, they don't care where they're going. It includes at least a wine visit. You have wineries in Santorini that they can accommodate thousands of people at the same time, just because of that. And as you can imagine, many of these cruise passengers, they select the cruise because they can control their tourism budget. They prepay the cruise and they have to pay nothing extra. They don't even buy a bottle of water in the destination. But they still visit the winery and they enjoy and they take photos and they promote it and they do whatever. So income, again, it can be varied. What is the wine involvement? Well, based on what I explained so far, as you can imagine, being a wine tourist, it doesn't mean that you have to be a wine lover. How many cases you have seen whereby you've been to a winery and people do not care about the wine? The wine is only the theme. It's the background. It's the reason why they're there. And they don't even care what they're drinking. They don't even know how to appreciate what they're drinking. Psychographic profile and motivation. Again, as you can understand, the psychographic profile and the reasons why people visit wineries or they go to wine destinations, it's not only because of the wine itself. So when we consider all this diversified profile of the contemporary wine tourist visitors, we need to create a quite diversified portfolio of wine experiences. And the typical approach that most of the wineries have, it's this Pine and Gilmore framework that we have always been using. We have entertainment activities, wine tastings, combined wine and food, educational master classes, particularly for those that they are interested about the wine and nothing else, or that's their primary reason. Aesthetic experiences, have your wading in the vineyards, go for a walk, for a hiking, have a concert, have a painting exhibition, whatever you name it. And of course, a lot of escapist experiences, like a hot air balloon or doing bungee jumping in a wine valley, picking up the grapes, stepping on the grapes, you name it. All these different experiences, they need to be there to appeal or at least to satisfy the different needs and profiles of different people. What are the different customer benefits or the values that we usually include in these wine tourism experiences? Again, based on the same framework, we give functional benefits in terms of tasting the wine, enjoying the food. Cognitive, to learn how to appreciate the wine or to do a wine tasting or how to match wine with food. Emotional benefits in terms of aesthetic enjoyment of the servicescape or the winescape. Networking and social benefits, or even lifestyle, to feel that you're important or to increase your ego, your social status by showcasing yourself consuming expensive wine or being in famous wine destinations. So all these, they do exist there. But the question nowadays is, in terms of what's the way forward and how wine tourism is going to evolve, or it should evolve. COVID, in some way, it has accelerated previous existing needs in terms of increasing sustainability and how we can make probably not just tourism, but also wine tourism sustainable. But again, is sustainable tourism or wine tourism enough? There is a lot of saying nowadays about regenerative tourism, whereby the mindset is in some way different. It's not only how to reduce the negative impacts, but it's also how to increase the positive impacts and create new resources or new meanings. So there are many buzzwords that we hear, particularly after COVID. Travel with purpose, responsible tourism, meaningful tourism. And all these, they are within the wider mentality of what we call the purpose economy, the meaning economy, the empathy economy, the compassion economy. I'm bored. I had enough, to be honest. I'm not sure whether all these are buzzwords or they really have a meaning, or whether we can put a meaning behind all these kind of buzzwords. So, key question, how can we make the wine tourism to become transformative, to help us become better citizens, better consumers, better businesses in the wine sector or in the tourism sector? Let's see some examples, or before we do this, let's have a basic example. And let's try to think, why do people drink? Again, I'll go quite forward very fast. I gave you many reasons before, isn't it, why people go for wine tourism? Either because they like to experience the wine, the aesthetic, or because they want to feel that they're part of a family, or they spend time with family and they socialize. Nowadays, a lot of people, they engage in tourism and also in wine tourism because they want to associate that with their self-development, to develop their personality, to increase their creativity, or to find meaning and authenticity. So how do we drink to become something? Think about what Red Bull does, which is a famous drink. When Red Bull promotes itself, it uses the motto or the slogan, "It gives you wings." I have never seen a campaign of Red Bull promoting itself by using the technical characteristics of the drink itself. I have seen many wineries or wines to promote the technical characteristics of the wine, though, isn't it? The smell, the aroma, the nose, isn't it? The color, whatever that is. Red Bull never does this. I don't think anyone cares what is inside Red Bull or how they do that. What Red Bull actually promotes, is it the feelings, the emotions, or the experiences? Because we are in the experience economy, the emotion economy, all these buzzwords that we were always hearing. Well, to be honest, Red Bull doesn't even sell emotions or experiences. They sell you a meaning or a solution to a problem that for you it has a meaning. Are you a student and you want to stay awake the whole night? So you read, you study, and you pass your exams? The solution is Red Bull. Are you somebody who, to find meaning, you want to go out clubbing all night long? You take Red Bull and you can stay dancing all night long. Are you somebody who wants to go around the globe by bicycle for a philanthropy or to gain experiences? Red Bull is your solution. What they sell to you is a solution to a problem that has a meaning for you, and you achieve purpose through it. That's what they sell, not even experiences. How do they do it? They sell you stories. They use heroes of people that they have achieved things. They have exceeded their physical limits by consuming this product. So when you go online, they have so many experiences that they relate the drink with. From water and sports to culture to traveling, you name it. Whatever you want to do or it has meaning for you, this can be related to Red Bull. So how can we develop wine tourism experiences that they also have a meaning and they help people to become better people or to enhance themselves and achieve what we actually claim as self-development? There is a lot of theory that relates to what we call transformative and social innovation. Basically, what it claims very, very quickly and simple is that people will select an experience or a product or an offering based on three things. Not only the physical attributes, if we take, for example, the wine, how the wine tastes, or what emotions it gives you, but they will also select it based on credence attributes, what they believe it is, wine production related to sustainability, I don't know, the wine history of the place, or the cultural attributes. What does it mean to consume or participate in wine experiences or wine for a destination? It's part of the history, the tradition, participate in the festival, that it's linked with the local cultural, the local lifestyle. Wine and tourism itself, it has many cultural elements to include into wine experiences. So let's see some examples. Worldwide, in terms of how they create this kind of wine experiences. When you look at this picture, does your mind goes that this is a winery? In fact, it is. Francis Ford Coppola Winery in Sonoma Valley. It's an integrated wine tourism resort. This is a very common trend that is coming up. If you go to their website, you see what they are promoting: wine, food, and adventure, a place to have fun and to find an enjoyable experience for the whole family. They have a cinema, they have a swimming pool, they have a spa, they have 3 different restaurants, they have a shopping, they have anything you can have or imagine to satisfy 3 or even 4 generations. And everything is related with the history and the family and the achievements of the entrepreneur who owns or who bought and has developed this kind of a winery. Wine is just in the background. Think about the winery in Barossa Valley, which is called Seppelfeld. That's a very famous worldwide winery. It is being developed in, again, what I call a wine tourism integrated resort. It has 3 different types of restaurants and fine dining, a catering, and a cafe where you can also use it to do picnic in the vineyards that it has. It has, of course, the cellar. It has the jam factory, which is actually a place where local entrepreneurs, they can have their own factory to create their pottery, to create things from metal, to create hats, and they showcase how to revive local culture and to exhibit it and to find an extra source of income, or to invite the visitors to learn how to also produce these items. They have a cooperage factory to explain you again the art of doing barrels and how this relates to the local history of the place. It has a photo exhibition, everything related with wine, but also with the local destination. And of course, they do a lot of events. It's an integrated resort where you can find things to do for days and not only for a visit within a day. How do we valorate cultural wine experiences? I used to be based in South Australia, one of the worldwide famous destinations in the world. There are at least 6 wine regions around a city center of Adelaide. They are currently applying to get the UNESCO destination World Heritage Site, like Oporto in Portugal. As you know, they base their claims in all the cultural and the history they have with Aboriginals, or not even that, with the first settlements in Australia from all different nationalities of the world. They have brought together many stakeholders to have a bottom-up approach in terms of how they do this. They involve them with seminars, with workshops, and of course, they involve stakeholders that they represent everyone. people from the wine industry and the tourism industry, people from the indigenous tribes, people from the local communities, from councils, governmental bodies from councils, federal and state. Because as you can imagine, this has to be negotiated or a collaborative activity from everyone. I've got many other examples, but I'm really very sorry. I need to go, so I will leave you with that. I hope I gave you plenty of food of thought to reflect and also to try to find other examples from your own regions. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Mariana. We are all very pleased to have you here and listen to your insightful and experience-rich thoughts about wine tourism and its opportunities and options and potentialities, and also challenges. Thank you so much. I know that you are in a hurry. I'm not sure if there is a question for you that you might eventually be answering here.
Yes, if there is something quick, I'm happy to answer.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I see here on the chat that people are welcoming you and are very pleased to have you. I don't see now yet. Excellent presentation, they say. Any question?
I'm happy to take questions by email as well if somebody thinks something later.
Yeah, okay, thank you a lot. Well, perhaps one question that I could pose you, because you are referring a lot to the new world examples. Do you think they are easy to replicate in Europe, in the old world destinations where people are working somehow in a different way still? And do you think we should...
I'm totally against replication. Copy-paste, I don't think it always works.
Yeah, but
adaptation is better.
Adaptation.
So yes, look, we work and we live in a highly interconnected, globalized world. Yeah, I can't believe that even if we have differences, we think differently, or nowadays we have different experiences. Once you are online, and we went online and we will stay online because of COVID, we share many experiences. Our values, our culture co-evolves globally. The fact that in India or in China, they have adopted the Western lifestyle or the wine consumption, it's all part of that. I don't want to believe, or I don't want to see the whole world to become homogenized and all become the same thing. I would prefer that every country, whoever keeps his or her own culture and values. But at the same time, I think we need to appreciate that there are some commonalities worldwide. So adaptation, yes, it's the best. I mean, you see what happens in the other world, and you try to incorporate it in your own culture to update, isn't it? And to offer something contemporary. Of course, it is harder for countries that they have a strong tradition, usually change or evolution. It's more difficult when you have a strong history, isn't it, or a background. But again, I don't believe that evolution should be the opposite extreme of tradition. You can have tradition, but you can have evolution as well.
Yeah, it's a matter of balancing it.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Otherwise, the tradition or the history is something dead, that it doesn't exist, and you just stage it and you offer it like a commercialized activity. Yeah. If you try to co-evolve it and keep it contemporary, then you're actually promoting or you're selling something that is alive, you know, something that is your authentic self. It's not a history that is dead and you just commercialize it.
Yeah, and actually it's a big asset to have all that history and all that authentic evolution of the wine and the territory and the culture. So it's something to work on, but still a challenge to make it perhaps more
I think European countries, they have to feel privileged. They have this tradition. The thing is how you valorize it in a good way.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So I think we can move on. Thank you, and once again, and have a good day.
All the best for the conference.
Thank you. Okay. So this was Mariana Sigala, and we will now move on to Michael Hall, and we are so pleased to have you here this morning, and actually very late at night in New Zealand. So I don't think that he requires a lot of presentation. He is so well known, so important in his field, and actually in tourism in general, specializing in food and wine, apart from many other topics, but also rural tourism development. And he will have his talk about co-creating sustainable rural tourism experience with food and wine, local culture, landscape, and people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Really, some of the things I'm saying will probably disagree with the previous speaker. I think much of what Mariana was saying in many ways were the same kinds of things that were being said 20 years ago. The generalizations we can make about the wine tourist. I'm going to take a different perspective, in part because my own perspective has changed over the years. In fact, as I'm sitting here in what we call my library room, I can smell this year's grapes outside this room. I think one of the problems we often have when we come to wine tourism research and agriculture is often done by academics that actually have very little experience and contact and the realities of rural life. In my case, I live next door to a dairy farm, quite literally. And I think some of the perspectives we therefore have are quite different. So I'm going to take something of a not so much a radical view, but a slightly cynical view about much of the discussion that occurs about wine tourism and food tourism as someone who's also a grower as well as an academic. I think the idea of sustainability, and we have Bernard with us, it's incredibly successful. It's everywhere, but it's almost so successful that if it's everything, is it then nothing? Everything becomes sustainable, and we often don't question it enough in terms of what it means. We know that in terms of wine and in terms of food, being green, being local, being sustainable, have been hot trends for years in food, wine, in restaurants. Are we any more sustainable? No, we're not. And in wine and food, of course, there's a huge amount of issues we face. There's the energy and greenhouse gas intensity of the wine and food we consume. There's the energy and emissions involved in transporting wine around the world. And I'm talking to one of the great wine exporting countries. There's the water footprint of foodstuffs. There's huge issues of biodiversity loss, and including insect loss, bee loss, much of which actually is the fault of agriculture itself. We have issues of landscape change. We have the emergence of agriculture monocultures. We have problems, enormous problems in some places with wine and food waste, and especially important in many parts of the world, including the Iberian Peninsula, including here in New Zealand and in the Southern Hemisphere at time, we have the exploitation of workers, particularly migrant workers, and otherwise sometimes illegal workers in the agricultural sector. What then is sustainable? If we're being dead honest about it, what then is sustainable? And if we bring it together with tourism, we've been trying to be sustainable for years. We keep trying to come up with alternative tourisms, but the more we've had alternative tourisms, the more we've had growth in the number of articles on sustainability, the number of government documents on sustainability, including wine and food, the less sustainable we are. We are here. What's next? We've already had COVID-19. We've already had so-called transformative tourism, which personally I think is a load of crap. It's nice, warm sounding stuff, but the reality, I think, is very different. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think tourism needs to be transformed. It certainly does. But the problem is, if you're not careful, like sustainability at times, it just becomes greenwash. It becomes a tag, and it doesn't actually mean much in terms of on-the-ground reality. Or, as I'm going to be also mentioning, it doesn't mean enough. It doesn't mean enough. Because for tourism to transform, you need the system to transform, not just individual businesses. You need the system to transform. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a systems problem. And I'm all in favor of tourism being regenerative or being transformative, but the reality is it's not. It's not, as it normally operates. If we have a discussion, as I would have, and as Mariana just has, about having a particular location where you may have a business that transforms itself, how did the tourists get there? Have they changed their way they get there? Have they still flown there? Or have they taken some other form of carbon-based transport? Because they have, we haven't solved the problem. We have a systems problem. And the standard model of sustainable tourism, to which I'm partly responsible, I put my hand up, looks like this, but it's wrong. It is absolutely wrong. And the rubbish that the UNWTO comes out who support this model is also wrong. Why is it wrong? Because we only have one planet. All of this is surrounded by the environment. The so-called balanced approach is a con. And I think what it strikes us with is that we need to understand scale. If we're talking sustainability, if we're talking co-creation, co-production, at what scale are we looking? Are we looking at the vineyard? Are we looking at the winery? Are we looking at the restaurant? Are we looking at the destination? Are we looking from farm to fork? Are we looking at the supply chain? And that is a really critical question. And in wine and food, we have the romance that we sell. The reality is often quite different. Much winemaking is an industrial process, but that's not the image we like to use. And I use the word we here. It's not the image we use, because showing you have stainless steel plants in which you make the wine, often very good fresh fruit driven wine, admittedly, doesn't fit the romance of wine. We therefore have the image and reality of many wine and food regions. The image is naturalness, rurality, artisanal production. The reality is the use of biocides, the use of biotechnology, impact on biodiversity. Often you have a number of very small artisan growers and winemakers, but they're actually dominated in terms of production by a number of very large companies. That's the reality of wine. And we can't pretend otherwise, even though we try to. You need to be thinking about a sustainable system and how tourism fits in with that. How are resources balanced? How are production, profits, and incentives balanced? And we need to think about sustainable viticulture. But it's difficult. Many places do not support sustainable viticulture. And I know from research Tim Baird and myself did several years ago, when we actually looked at all the sustainable wine growing programs in the world, what was fascinating isn't just what's there, it's what is not there, or the proportion of involvement or requirements for those sustainable wine growing programs, where they were focused on. Water management and soil management's a high priority, but then you start getting to other areas which are nowhere near as significant. And what's also significant is that many countries in their sustainable wine growing programs, and I think we can expand out to food growing, do not address socioeconomic issues. Even if we use the old model of sustainability in which you have that so-called balanced approach, the social dimension is not just the residents, it's also the workers. And the reality is, in so many wine and food regions out the world, if you took away the cheap labor from migrants, you could not produce food at the price you do. And that gets ignored time and time and time again in all the crap I hear about sustainable rural tourism. It really does. We acknowledge the mobile population of tourism, but we ignore the mobile population of the workers without which it would not be picked, and their exploitation. How then can you have sustainable rural tourism and genuine co-creation unless you acknowledge that? The food supply chain is complex. It is very complex. This is what it looks like. If you're serious about sustainability, though, all of those points need to be considered, not just what happens at the winery and what the visitor does there, but through all different points. And if we're thinking of the supply chain for wine, there are so many different elements of it. All of these elements layered on top of each other, all of these need to be considered as part of sustainable wine growing, sustainable food growing, getting the wine from the grower through eventually to the consumer. All of these things are important. And you know something? This diagram is something we were showing 20 years ago. It's the notion of the system. We have it all the time when we talk about tourism, but we don't actually think about it, how it should be dealt with. It's the system. If you're serious about sustainability, it is the system. Yes, I can go through and I can talk what happens at the level of a winery. We can talk about the significance of the tasting room experience, the importance of the experience, entertainment, the importance of education, and the information you can give them. We've known all of this for 20 plus years as well, actually probably even longer if I think of the first papers that were being done. There is nothing very new in this whatsoever. We are just recycling that over and over and over again. Why? Because we're not dealing with the problem. What are the problems? Things which are local are not necessarily sustainable. Things which are local are not necessarily sustainable. You can grow something locally, but it can have all sorts of biocides and chemicals to make it grow. And that is something which is forgot. It's the local trap. It may be good in some ways in terms of food mass, but it could be grown incredibly unsustainably. Just having a vegetarian or a vegan dish on the menu does not a sustainable food revolution make. Was land cleared to grow it? Where did it come from? What's the supply chain? We have to avoid the trap. And to do that, we need to place culinary, food, and wine tourism in a wider systems context. We need to place that in terms of a genuine low emissions future. That may mean your market may not come from China or India or forever, but may actually need to come much more locally. That's the reality. If you think of a system, you need to think of all elements of the system in terms of what makes it sustainable. And having long distance tourists does not make a sustainable tourism system. So what is the research menu? How do we change the research menu as well? Because those questions are not usually asked. The real sustainable model looks something like this. Economies of society are surrounded by the environment. It's the environment. I've got blue here because it's the planet. And the more that we take away from natural capital, the more problems we have, because there's so few species. And the real problem of thinking about these kinds of issues looks like this. You can have an area which has too many tourists. You move them around. You keep moving them around because that's your solution. That is what most thinking about sustainability does. You have one area which has too many tourists, we'll put them somewhere else. The problem is you only have one planet. You only have one macro system. And if you have something that's sustainable one scale, if you think systematically, you're then overwhelmed by all the other changes that occur. And that's the problem that we face, and that's the problem that we ignore. If we are serious about trying to deal with sustainable tourism in agricultural areas, that's what we do. It's not only that no man or no human is an island, but no destination is an island either. To be able to have genuine sustainable food and wine tourism that's co-created, if you want to use that phrasing, then in that case, you have to think of the system. Yes, you can do well locally, but unless you think of the system overall, we still are not solving the problem of sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this, well, very intriguing thoughts. And I totally agree. We are usually missing the systems level. Looking locally, it's a big challenge. However, then we could also ask, is any tourism sustainable? And is it possible to have sustainable tourism at all if people move around? And is the entire economic system sustainable? So
the answer to that's easier. The answer to that is probably no, but you can have sustainable tourism. The problem, you can imagine tourism being more sustainable with more trips. We can have more trips. The problem is, how far do you go and how fast do you go? If you have lots of shorter trips, you're not using anywhere near as much of the resources you are by having lots of long ones. I mean, the solution actually isn't that difficult. The problem is tourism marketers, destinations. Why? Because having international tourists is so much sexier than having domestic. It is, it's ridiculous.
And if you think of countries like Portugal and others, you probably need the international travelers also because of different capacity, economic power. So you need the international tourists to come in to have also economic sustainability of your offer.
Yes, possibly, but why do they need to come from China?
Yeah, of course.
But seriously, because if you think of it, if you had other European visitors instead of Chinese visitors, think of how that would cut the emissions. I mean, it's where the market is from is important.
It's very
I'm obviously playing devil's advocate. I think you can have international visitors, but how far do they come?
Yeah, and how do they move? Is it necessary to always?
How do they move? Yeah. How do they move? How do they move?
Yeah.
And in that sense, Portugal is arguably better than some countries in that there is a rail network of sorts.
That is not so good, actually. And there has been some discussion about the investments in Portugal, rather on airports than on trail connections to Europe and high-speed trail connections. That's absolutely.
And I think one of the other points I would suggest with that, what I find interesting, if you have people going around by train, it's actually better for the rural economy than coming into an airport, because there's more stopping points, and that stopping point becomes the critical thing.
Yeah. There must be some revolution in transportation for sure. And I think the European community is moving into that direction, but there are still a lot of challenges here, especially crossing borders, getting good connections to the center of Europe. It's not so easy from Portugal. I'm now looking here at the chat, and I see Gorka Samarenio saying, thanks for the presentation, great. Is a sustainable tourism activity possible? Well, what I said before, can wine production be sustainable? An example would be the weight of the bottles and even the packaging or labeling.
Actually, there's some very interesting work there. I know in normal times when I'm in Europe, you do actually have some countries will export some of their wine bulk and bottle it actually at the destination. That's one way around it. And of course, in other cases, you can have wine going by ship, which is nowhere near as carbon intensive as God forbid, in some places they send it by plane. So that there are things like that which can be done. And you know, it's interesting that there are some niche solutions there, but what we need is to be more widely adopted in the industry.
And Aima is asking, I would like to know your opinion regarding new rurality in rural tourism. Do you think what kind of phase rural tourism we will have in the future?
Far too much fake rural tourism, actually. Far too much fake rural tourism. I think a lot of rural tourism is fake anyway, in the sense that you have pretend farms and that sort of thing. Although saying this, one of my things at the moment, there's a lot of attention being given to virtual reality, augmented reality. I actually think there's a real opportunity there for rural tourism, because I actually think that what potentially can be sold is the authentic. Now, I know we can argue what's the authentic, but I genuinely believe that there are going to be people who will be into the high tech. There is a real niche for switching off and engagement and meeting real people. And that includes sampling local food. All those things that, you know, we usually associate, I actually think they have a really strong future. What's important is not to get sucked in by there's academics as well and researchers who tell wineries and food producers, you've got to do this online. No, you don't. It's just a promotional channel. And I think that's the thing to bear in mind. You don't make your money from just being online. It's promotional channel. You make your money by having those people experience the authentic. I mean, and I think to me, that it should be the future I would go down.
That makes me remember the yesterday session. There was one technology session in which there was an experience context described about virtual reality, and actually what came out from this experience is that people actually, what they value most is real reality. So
exactly.
That is the most impactful thing, and it might eventually trigger your interest to go to a certain place, but it never substitutes.
No, I agree. I completely agree.
Okay. Any further questions? Well, if not, perhaps we now move on to Bernard. Thank you so much for the very interesting speech. And now let's try to communicate through WhatsApp, yes, with Bernard. And perhaps if you can stay until the end, perhaps there is some further question and debate that we can talk together about. Yeah. So Bernard, are you able to talk now? We had some technical problems in the beginning, but I hope they are solved now. We cannot hear you now. Hello? I think we lost Bernard again. Oh, yeah, okay, here you are. So, well, Bernard Lane is also a very renowned researcher in rural tourism and sustainable tourism. And he has been along here around at the conference already since the beginning, so I also don't need to.
Okay.
Oops, I think there are some echoes here.
Echoes. Can you still hear me? No. Yes? Oh, good. So I'm simply running on the phone now, which is struggling, but we should get there. Well, that was very interesting, partly because of the discussion about what is sustainability, which rumbles on even after 30 years or more. And I don't know if Michael can still see us, but I shall be referring to an early book which he produced or helped produce later. I'm going to talk about the issues in rural tourism, which is a sort of umbrella for a lot of rural wine tourism. One of the things I have learnt, I realized the other night I've been involved in rural tourism, either providing accommodation and meals or advising about it for 55 years. That's a terribly long time. And a lot has happened in that time. So if we go back to the 1960s, when some of you wouldn't have been born, rural tourism was in its infancy, except in the European Alps, where it was almost certainly a century old by then, but everywhere else it was unknown. And wine tourism was unknown because you almost had to get to a rural area before you could see wine tourism. So this presentation talks about the last 60 years and how rural tourism has changed and become more successful, in inverted commas, and more, hopefully, more sustainable. That's a long, difficult trek. It will describe the very exciting challenges which academics in particular face in the next 20 years and how they can be involved in changing the world, because that was always been my role, or role I tried to play over this time. Well, rural tourism begins almost by chance. The two elements came together. On the supply side, agricultural change by the 1960s became pressing. Post-war food shortages were fading away, food prices were falling, and to compete in the new agricultural world, many farmers found they had to invest in a lot of new technology. I recall working on a dairy farm when the famous milking parlors were installed, and really you had to have 70 cows to make it worth your while. Many farms had a hard time because of that. Many farmers left farming and took non-agricultural jobs. Governments looked at rural areas and said, what they need is industry, because that's worked everywhere else. But industry doesn't work well in rural areas. They're remote and they don't have the right workforce. Some farms took very big loans from the banks to modernize themselves and expand, and suffered every time the interest rate went up. A few farmers, particularly the farm I was then living on, began to take visitors. And this was regarded by neighboring farmers as an admission of failure for various reasons. They were often laughed at. They've got to take visitors. Secretly, a lot of these people were quite jealous because rural tourism made real money and it was handed over immediately, not 28 days later. So there was a move in rural areas to accommodate visitors. And I use that term, accommodate, very deliberately, because we didn't do very much more than accommodate them in the beginning. Oh, this only worked because the second element was a changing society. As people became better educated, more curious, and more adventurous. And that encouraged tourism. They also had more money. That encouraged tourism to new destinations. And in Europe, that at first became flying down to the Mediterranean, because the railway companies never really understood that airplanes had great advantages over very lengthy, uncomfortable train journeys. In the beginning, the aeroplanes used were converted Second World War bombers. Most of the passengers didn't know that, but that was how they grew. And all that was made possible because of television, which began to run travel programs that excited people, and the travel pages of newspapers, which expanded and enabled me to buy a house, because I used to write features for those travel pages. But television is the forgotten real changer of things. If we go back to 1950, there was a man called David Attenborough, which all British people know, and because his programs are now exported all over the world, most of the world probably knows David Attenborough, who is now 90, I think 96, and still working hard. So that's a model to look at. He had gone to Cambridge University, done a degree in zoology and geology, so he knew about, he thought, nature and animals and plants, particularly animals. He joined the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the state-owned broadcasting corporation, in 1957, and he set up a natural history unit. And rural tourism benefited enormously from the programs that were created when you were able to see on your television the exciting things that grew and lived in the countryside. And there were copies of David Attenborough, perhaps not so long-lived, in my phone. Hold on. I'm just going to pass it on. Oh, good, it's been answered. In many other countries. Secondly, prior to about 1960, the countryside was very difficult to reach, but we have seen this huge growth in car production. Since the war, European car production has
Well, it seems that we have technical problems again.
Yes, we lost Bernard.
So probably he will try to dial in again. Well, in the meantime, I could perhaps pose a question that I saw here on the chat, and perhaps Michael could answer.
I'm back.
It's about how can we define authenticity in rural farms tourism? How can one stage, script, and experience if not arranged with the farm? If not, how immersion happens in a way not disrespecting the normal day?
Authenticity is almost by definition a very fuzzy and hazy term. You can't treat it as an absolute. You really can't. You can't treat it as an absolute. I think the main thing is, to me, is it a working property? Are the people actually engaged in the relationship with the visitor, not purely for money, but actually are they also interested in educating the consumer about the realities of rural life? I think those things become part of what make up authenticity, but you can't treat it in absolute terms.
Yeah, and it cannot really be designed. It must be
No,
something natural.
No, I think it's one of those. I think it's one of those things in which you can have a cluster of definitions or a cluster of concepts. See, but there's never any such thing as a perfect definition.
Yeah.
Just don't put it in absolute terms. It's the way I approach it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I think Bernard is here again.
Bernard is back.
Yeah, I'm here
Yes.
again. Yes,
Thank
and
you.
Michael is here, and
Yes, yes.
there you are. Good. Well, I've lost track of where I was,
You
but
were
I was increasing
in
car
car
production.
industry.
Yeah, the car industry in Britain alone produced 4 million cars a year in 1960, and it now, even though we have very little car production, 33 million cars a year today. And they were critical in allowing rural tourism to start, and they have been in almost everywhere else. But at the same time, and this is where Michael comes back in, tourism began to change. The so-called mass tourism, where we went to resorts, began to change. And in 1992, two bright young academics, one of whom was Michael, and the other, Betty Weiler, a Canadian who moved to Australia. And after all, Michael is an Englishman who moved to New Zealand, actually, but occasionally was in Australia. They produced a book called Special Interest Tourism. And it was bright yellow and very, very interesting. Had 15 chapters. Michael and Betty contributed about 3 of those chapters, but there were lots of other contributors. But neither food nor wine tourism had a chapter, although they did have 3 mentions. Rural tourism didn't get a mention at all in that book. That's in 1992. By 1994, rural tourism had a special double issue of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, published a 75-page guide to rural tourism for the public sector and for governments in both French and English. And academics were now alive to this growing activity. Over in Canada, in Calgary, a man called Don Getz, who I hope is still alive, produced in 2000 a book called Exploring Wine Tourism, Management, Development and Destinations. So things began to happen on the ground and on the research front. Now, there are very interesting things which we didn't quite realize at that time. The whole growth of rural tourism and wine and food tourism was random. Some areas developed numerous accommodation sites, others didn't. There was just almost chance whether there was interest and whether that interest was fostered by anybody or any organization. The other interesting thing which was interesting was that those offering rural tourism knew very little about tourism. They just did it. And if it worked, they continued to do it. If it didn't, they stopped. And there was therefore a generally random, unplanned and disorganized nature to the way rural tourism and wine tourism developed. Many governments did not believe in rural tourism because they said this is terrible. It will distract farmers from growing food. But farmers were not getting enough money, so they got distracted. They offered very little training or assistance in the beginning. We'll come back to that. Rural tourism concentrated on offering accommodation. That's fundamental, but very little effort was put into marketing or producing a product, turning the countryside into a place worth and able to visit. public transport providers couldn't understand those tourists. They were not there all the time. And heritage providers were worried they might wear out the heritage if too many of them came. There was a serious lack of governance or long-term planning. That was true of rural tourism in general, and certainly true of food and wine tourism. Random. Society became interested in wine. Obviously, it was always interested in wine in places like France or Italy, but outside that area, certainly in Britain, I can remember that when one of my elder brothers went to university, he produced a bottle of wine for Christmas. And my father, who worked in a brewery, didn't know what to do with it. You only had a very tiny glass, not a litre or whatever it was. But again, the media, television and newspapers spread interest in wine. And gradually, the idea of going to look at a winery, which I think happened when I was about 40 years old, began to grow. And I can remember looking rather like the picture I briefly saw from Michael, which showed these, not as I thought, some wild grape growing area, but a series of almost factory-like rows of vines growing somewhere in France, and being a little bit shocked. The knowledge of how tourism worked amongst wine growers or even rural tourism providers remained poor. And the idea of partnership between a grower and accommodation remained weak. And the idea of a partnership that would bring in transport providers, heritage providers, and so on was also weak. And it continued like this until it was realized that rural tourism offered a very valuable feature, that it could help the regeneration of rural economies. And that made governments get interested in this. The classic example of how governments became interested in this and what they did came from the EU, which technically, as an Englishman, I'm not allowed to mention. I may be, I don't know, sent to Ukraine if I'm seen to be talking about the EU. The EU set up leader projects. And I'm sure you all know about leader projects, but they became classic encouragers of change, development, and partnerships, because they are in effect local development partnerships. And that enabled bright young people who knew nothing about tourism or rural regeneration to work in leader projects and use a group of tools which were becoming available, things like routes and trails, heritage interpretation systems, visitor centres. You have to have a visitor centre under leader, almost. And the idea of sustainable tourism struggled into life. I recall going to the OECD to talk about sustainable rural tourism in the 1980s. And the French, Greek, and Spanish delegates wanted me stopped because they were doing very well and they didn't want rural tourism. They had beach resorts, and they also could not understand that anything could be sustainable. And this is what Michael, the bit I heard of what Michael said, is still talking about 30 years later, that things don't become totally sustainable. Some things are more sustainable than others, and it's a very, very slow educational process. Rural tourism at that stage found a new player. And this was the slow discovery by protected area managements that they could use tourism to bring in money and help pay for their work in protected areas. And that it would be valuable politically if tourists came, because they would demand national parks. They liked the idea. It was an exciting type of place to visit. And that meant that they could use sustainable tourism as a management opportunity of financial and political value. And gradually, more and more protected areas came on board. It was then realized that it is not natural for rural people to market themselves or their areas. They don't know anything about it. They produced flyers, but they're a very sort of limited form of activity. But suddenly, online marketing became a possibility. And as most of you know, on long, dark winter nights, what better than to sit in front of your computer, click on Google, and look at what would it be like to go to Aveiro. And if Aveiro has, I can't recall, a good website, you might go. Protected areas also realized they had to market themselves and say what they were doing. Gradually, the idea of having almost virtual large rural destinations, decentralized, scattered across a landscape, came into being. And this was dubbed by a certain Elizabeth Castenholz and myself as the second generation rural tourism, where people began to work together. And you can read all about that in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism in 2015. The way that the website works, you just put our names in and you'll get taken to a whole special issue, which was based on a conference held in Aveiro. So what happens next then? Well, the second generation is still struggling to get going, but we have to look beyond that over the next 20 years. What might happen, what could happen, what should happen, and how do you all as academics get involved in this? Well, there are always, in any form of change for the better, there are challenges, there are opportunities. Challenges is a good name for problems. The immediate challenge we've got is that of COVID-19, which I recently have had, so I can speak about that in a rather knowing way. Don't get it, it's not much fun. You see, until COVID-19 appeared, tourism seemed to be going to grow forever. And we were terribly worried about over-tourism, which was a new word which had come into the language. All the ideas of growth, and tourism was based on growth. They'd love to have bigger and bigger numbers every year. Suddenly were seriously challenged. And at first, a lot of tourism commentators, including myself, thought this will be great. It'll make a break with the past and we'll be able to get a new form of sustainable tourism everywhere, because people will realize they have to think ahead in tourism and try and manage it. I now doubt that because partly we have seen quite a number of tourism businesses go out of business, especially small rural businesses where people actually abandoned their tourism work and tried to go back into farming, organic, of course. Many rural tourism business owners retired. They were getting to the end of their working lives. And many became terribly worried about having guests in their properties because they might bring the virus with them. And many guests didn't go because they thought they'd catch the virus from other visitors. Very few rural tourism businesses dared to market their open air healthy advantages, that you could be healthier in a rural area than in a city or a major resort. They neither dared to do it, nor often did they need to do it, because they were not in any form of marketing partnership. And nowadays you have to know how to operate online to do that. Individuals often don't know that. Assuming that we can get over COVID-19, vaccinate our way out of it and so on, we then face a group of technical issues that worry the rural tourism sector, especially in Europe. The first problem they face, curiously, is vegetarianism, or the rise of the total number of vegans, because many of Europe's best, as it were, rural tourism areas are in mountainous areas, which rely on grazing animals, which are then killed off and eaten. And without the grazing animals, you don't have a very attractive landscape, because the trees take over. Vegetarianism has been boosted by people who either don't eat meat or eat less meat because they want to live longer, or for ethical reasons. They don't like the idea of killing off lambs and calves and so on, or because grazing animals produce a lot of green gas emissions. And if you've ever worked on a dairy farm, you'll know about those emissions. And even lowland areas now are seeing a reduction in animal numbers, because people worry about their health if they consume too many dairy products. So they replace them by strange milks made from oats or potatoes or soya. Second problem that is worrying is the growth of Airbnb, which is an American concept founded in 2008, which operates as an online marketplace for low-cost short-term accommodation in both rural and urban areas. Growth has been very rapid, partly because of low costs for the visitor and few regulations for the supplier. But Airbnb doesn't bring much money into rural economies because it's cheap, and it's very rarely operates with other parts of the economy to create a destination. Next point is, there's a huge interest now in rewilding, that we can reintroduce traditional vegetation systems, woods, or traditional animals, natural pre-farming animals, such as wolves or various large mammals. And society has become very excited about rewilding. People who live in rural areas are much less excited because they fear the loss of agricultural jobs. There are a whole series of partnerships being created in Britain at the moment to have wild areas taking land out of farming, making them look more natural. The problem is the visitor is not sure what is wild and what is not. And the reintroduction of bears, wolves, and wildcats frightens local people and is opposed. And it all sometimes frightens visitors when they come face to face with such animals. But it's a lot of research needed there. there's another exciting thing which we ought to mention. That's slow tourism. Slow tourism emerged from the slow food movement, which grew first in Italy, led by a man called Carlo Petrini. And you can see lots of things about that. And it led to other slow concepts called slow food, slow living, slow cities, and so on, and slow tourism. In a rural context, slow tourism implies minimizing travel distances, maximizing the time available on a trip, relaxing the mind, eating and shopping locally, minimizing mechanization, having a low tourism carbon footprint, and seeking authenticity, whatever that is. It was, it still is, largely an academic concept. As a consultant, on about 5 occasions, I have tried to convince a community that it would work well if it looked at slow tourism, but most of them don't understand it, and they think anything slow is just boring, because people have been taught to believe in a world of speed is everything and fastness, and they want to get tourists in, spending money quickly. And you say, yes, but you can do it by get a very special breed who don't damage your area and spend a long time if you push slow tourism. Oh, okay, but they don't like it. The last point to make is that as we come out of COVID, rural tourism, including wine and food tourism, is in very strong competition with all those cruise ships, which people love to go on, conventional resorts, which provide lots of jobs and need to grow again, and the great cities of the world who want to get into heritage tourism using their city cultural attractions. And you have to know that the great cities and the cruise ship companies and the conventional resorts have vast amounts of experience at marketing themselves and huge investments which they can draw on to help them move along. And they don't want to lose. What can we do to fight back, and how can academics become involved? Well, it's a question of understanding and satisfying the market's changing needs. It's a question of retaining its original unique selling points of small scale, personal service, local ownership, healthy, natural environments. But it's got to be interesting, and it's got to be organized more professionally. I can see Elizabeth smiling because she's heard me say this for about 20 years. One of the best ways forward that I would argue is to get partnerships between local governments, including protected area management, rural tourism interests, public transport operators, heritage interests, and a very special group of academics who work in lifelong learning, or in some cases called extramural education, or in America, extension studies. And if you want to see how this can work, if you go to the open access journal Sustainability for 2021, you can find a paper on agritourism development in the USA, the strategy of the state of Michigan, which shows proven ideas for linking business, academia, and government together. And because I used to work in that area, I think that's a great idea. But it still means that, as Michael was saying, that sustainability is going to be hard to do, particularly because, as he mentioned, if an area can get some Chinese tourists, who come a terrific distance, they're thrilled by it. It shows they're doing the right thing. People are coming all that way, but on the way, they're burning lots of fuel and producing lots of emissions. We have to get back to a partnership series with railways and bus companies and longer times on site. And there is a printed version of what I'm saying with lots of websites that show where this can work. It's very difficult. Accommodation providers have to try harder, because if you've ever worked in accommodation, there's nothing quite so annoying as a guest, except in the last moment when the bill is paid. But you have to learn to be nice to them and provide guests with information about the area, with pickups from stations and so on. Marketing for well-being tourism, that is another growth area. Advertising how healthy you could be and having well-marked, well-organized walking, hiking, even running possibilities. And you also have to realize that the great market is in old people. There are more and more of these damned old people like me. In 2020, there were an estimated 727 million people in the world aged over 65. And they love rural holidays because they can take short walks if there are any, and they can relax and try to live longer. And research shows that the 60 to 80-year-old market is very considerable. We need to also move forward. One of the ways I favor is developing heritage interpretation. Now, in the past, that was largely a question of very boring notices stuck on walls talking about geology, or very expensive visitor centres that are okay for the first 5 years, but then need reorganization and refitting, and that's a slow process. There is a case for putting all that online, because people with smartphones can then follow routes which will even tell them when they're going wrong and get them back online in the right place. And you can have music and poems and so on. Again, if you get the printed version of this, there are a couple of examples you can look at from when you're reading it. The heritage strategies have to be linked to the marketing strategies, and accommodation providers have to get involved. There's the whole idea of slow tourism corridors, which have a public transport system running down the centre and activities coming off them. It's a variation on the trail theme, but it's a little bit more exciting. Overall, we have to learn, as you will all know, to sell experiences rather than just places. And the only way to do that would be to get better governance and more professional governance. And again, universities have a role here, because they should be training all those people who can work in that area. And finally, I would say one of the strange things is that although there are usually national organizations that work on rural tourism, we've never really succeeded in going beyond that point. The idea of a European rural tourism organization has been tried, but has always struggled. It was created some years ago, based in the south of Spain, run by a German, called Eurogite, or Eurogite, as we say in English. And that has now, because it wasn't very successful, rebranded itself as Rural Tour. We don't know if that will work, but I doubt it. But it's got to have a role in life, and it's got to be recognized. And academics could assist that process in many different ways. Okay, so those are some of the wider issues that you could look at and some of the background. And I'm delighted to know that all this was possible using my mobile phone. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bernard, for your very insightful explanations about the background of rural tourism, the evolution, and all the factors that condition the future of it, and the ideas that you made clear here about very important topics for research as well, and of course of action to make sustainable rural tourism a possibility, not necessarily a reality, but the way to it perhaps better. And we have also a role in here discussing this with our students and continuing our research in the field. Thank you so much. I will now present you 2 questions, and I understand that they may be to you and to Michael as well. It's about the model of corporate farming. Maria Partali is asking, do you believe that the model of corporate farming replacing family farming may be a challenge for rural tourism in the future, in addition to the fact of rural aging all over Europe? Thank you. And the second question, how supply agents of wine regions can adapt the offer according to the concept of slow tourism, by Mariana Cabral. So the issue of corporate farming, the rural aging in Europe, and slow tourism. Could you perhaps refer to that quickly?
Well, Michael is furthest away, so he can go first.
Okay.
In the case of corporate farming, yeah, corporate farming is an absolute nightmare. I think one of the really important things to remember is that rural tourism and farm tourism was often a way of keeping the family farm in the family. There's always been that connection. I think, though, then as well as tourism, it needs to be much better integrated with the time for production that occurs on the farm. Still has to occur and be smarter. That'd be my first comment. The second question, sorry, again, was?
It was about the rural aging all over Europe, if that would be a major problem.
Yes, it is. And that is a real challenge. I find it very frustrating, because I think in some countries, and I know there have been initiatives in some parts of Spain and Italy, I don't know about Portugal, have actually had some of the illegal migrants actually going to the rural areas to become involved in them. I think so long as some of the racist right-wing parties in both countries don't do what they often do, there's great potential to do that. And I know Spain and Portugal have some very good schemes to try and encourage people to go back to rural areas. I think it's that more holistic thinking to encourage younger people to go to those areas, encouraging them to come back after they've been elsewhere, bringing their skills back with them. And to be honest, I think one of the ways in which that happens is because of the cost of housing may be so much cheaper. So I think it's a case of working with that dynamic. However, it does require smart, innovative, intelligent municipalities, which we don't always have. We don't always have, but we do have, there are some good examples. And I think it requires that kind of thinking to realize that. And I think as part of that, and I think Bernard might have some comments on this, I think one of the things that always excites me is when you have some of the older people who have skills which otherwise might be lost and can train people coming back because they are of interest to tourists and because they are more sustainable. Things like dry stone walling, you know, those kinds of traditional skills, which are very important in terms of sustainability, can also be a win-win in terms of tourism. And they're the kind of things you need schemes and programs to be supportive, because in the long run, I do actually think they become self-sustaining and don't need government support.
Yeah.
Well, I'd agree with almost all of that, but not quite. The fact that small farms almost have to take visitors to stay in business does encourage rural tourism. Corporate, if owned by a remote corporation, as Michael says, can be a disaster because they are run by people who don't know the area and are only interested in profits. But curiously, most of the land of Britain, certainly before the First World War, was run on a corporate basis, but these were locally owned large estates. And the large estate acted as a partnership system and often developed things very successfully because they had the resources, being larger, they had access to banks and were believed when you went to the bank, and they could think in the long term. I worked some years ago with the Duke of Northumberland, who has large amounts of land in the north of Britain and many farm tenants, and he was able to bring them together and advise them and assist them and help them to market things. But the large estate, for all sorts of reasons, is dying out in Britain and may be replaced by a rather faceless corporate system, which would not be a good idea. Now I've forgotten, because I'm very old, the second question, which was about...
It was about the rural aging. The aging of the rural population.
Number of older people in rural areas. Yeah. Yes. Well, we are approaching a crisis because of the number of old people. Where I live, I am the chairman of a 44-house small suburb, and the majority of people are now in these 44 houses over 75 years, and they don't work. They're very lonely in many cases. And we are setting up a futures committee to see how we can keep people alive and happy and busy. We're not going to take visitors, as far as I know. I've not suggested that, but we have to try and keep people going. So there is a dual purpose in involving. Certainly there are a lot of older tourists who want a quieter, more personal visit to an area. But there are also a lot of older people who would benefit from being involved in that process from the supply side. I used to encourage tourist information centres to be staffed by older people who needed training, but they enjoyed their times working in tourist information centres, not least because it allowed, if you were very clever, you to put together elderly men and elderly women who might get on very well or not, but you had to be careful. So there's another set of research topics there. How do you produce product that is useful by older people? There's some information in the written version of that here. And how do you get the older people in the community to come out act as tour guides. I've just put them out of a job by saying do it all on your smartphone, but you could do both. And people do love to meet local people because it's an additional experience. We met somebody who was 100 years old and could still tell us about the area. We only have one 100-year-old person in the 44 houses that we've got. She's very fit, and we have at least 12 people well over 90. So, but they don't work with tourists. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other question was about how supply agents of wine regions can adapt to offer according to the slow tourism concept. Do you think that is something interesting?
That's quite a difficult question. The answer is how do they well the answer is to supply sufficient items of interest so that people don't rush through their area but stay and walk from one place to another place and have something to look at. This is where Michael's discussion about watching how dry stone walls are made is quite interesting. Equally, if you can get involved in working a small area of vineyard to show what is involved in pruning, picking, and all this sort of thing, and actually, you know that there used to be traditional jokes that grapes were crushed by usually men in bare feet. And perhaps we could bring that back.
You still have that in Portugal sometimes, yes.
And in fact, some of the vineyards here do that with tourists, partly for novelty.
Yes.
I mean, I think my answer to the question would be, first of all, why? I wouldn't romanticize slow tourism. It can be very advantageous. I think Bernard has the key point. It's that how many people do you want? How long do you want them to stay? And how are they going to get there? I think you need to have that as your big picture. And then whatever you call the tourism is fine, but it could be slow or not too slow, but not too fast either. I think the main thing is to think about what do you require in terms of your facilities? What are you trying to achieve with tourism? Go to basics. How many people you can take over what time period, and what's the best way of having them there in the community that the community actually want? That to me is a starting point, rather than just think slow tourism.
Yeah. Well, it's very typically, it's a very academic concept. Yeah. Someone's had a great time on a Saturday afternoon devising it, but they've never actually done it.
Yeah.
And either as a provider or as a visitor.
I was a member of the slow food movement for quite a few years, and I still think they do great things in biodiversity. But what were they also doing? Having large international festivals and congresses, getting people coming from all over the world. Yeah. And they couldn't see the irony in that. Yes. But at the same time, they do great work with the arc of taste and biodiversity conservation.
And they keep Nestle in check.
Yes, very much. I'm always in favor of that.
Well, I thought you might. Perhaps a final question, because we are getting on into the next sessions. So I would only refer now to Rafaela Malerba's question about how can suppliers, wine route administrations, and local DMEOs contribute to sustainable wine tourism systems going beyond their own operations. So here we are again at the systems challenge. Do you think that the suppliers and the DMEOs and the wine route organizers, they could do something to make the system more sustainable?
Yes. Yes. I'm going to put it in business terms. because people think when I'm going, I'm a raving academic. I am, but I think in very practical business terms. There's two critical things. One is to talk to each other, which is easier said than done, but talk to each other and find common ground. And what's important is the process, not the document you wave at the end, that may have its uses. But the really important thing is to get away from thinking about growth in numbers and to think about yield. Think about it in really strong business terms and think about it in terms of yield. I have found this so frustrating for so many years because growth is not the same as yield. They are quite different.
Yeah.
And I think if you think about it in terms of yield, that becomes the common, for me anyway, in business terms, that becomes the common ground by which you can say, okay, this is the most, not just an efficient solution, but the most effective solution for what we want to achieve, and will maximize the benefits of tourism. To me, to be quite honest, it's really simple, and that's it. Focus on bloody yield, excuse my language, rather and shift away from growthism. But I do know from having worked for politicians, because I never, ever meant to become an academic, you know, people like simple solutions to complex problems. And sometimes just being able to talk about growth in business numbers, politicians like that. If we can get them to be thinking about yield rather than that, that would help as well.
Yeah.
That is, in real terms, usually when I work in a community, I have to explain to them they don't want day visitors under any circumstances. They leave litter, they take the parking places, and they spend relatively little. The key to it, and people gasp at this point, is to say, you've got to get them into bed.
Yes.
Because then they are paying money into your community while they're asleep.
Absolutely.
And they're totally harmless at that point.
Absolutely.
That is such a simple point that people don't get it. They worry about this. But so therefore, in a recent job we did in a small town whose shops were having a hard time because it was all being done online and shopping, and so what you've got to get is more hotels. Oh, we don't want those, they said. They will bring in migrants to work.
Here we go. Yes.
Now, the migrant issue is a very interesting one because in rural areas, migrants rarely stay. They learn English and they learn sort of the skills you acquire if you work in accommodation. But after a couple of years, they go away and use it somewhere else. So it's quite rare to get the migration problems that you get in the big cities with large numbers of low wage people. You do get difficulties occasionally with modern day slavery on remote farms, but that's a different problem which I can't answer.
Well, there are many questions left probably, but I think we need to finish and close the session. Thank you so much for all your experience, your thoughts, your ideas, and the challenges to all us researchers. It was a very interesting session. Thank you so much. And you are invited to continue with us over the entire program that is online. Yeah, you know it. Thank you so much, and see you later.
Good. Thank you.